Yes.
Hello, how are you doing?
Let's go live.
Microphone check, 1, 2. Microphone check, 1,
Oh,
2.
I know about this. Yeah, I think. Just 1 second, sorry. And change too many things at once. So we just went live, but we mute the audio output. For now. We just went live. We mute the audio output. Yeah.
It sounds like if you decouple them, it will be the negative. Give a second.
You all hear me?
And the.
It's just, I think it just says that,
He said, here's where stitch together.
yeah, and reverse.
Well, the day first, and then her second. And then,
Okay, so mine is stitched up.
yeah, unless he gets them to be
thank all of those who make our programming possible: the Scientific and Cultural Facilities District, the Stewart Family Foundation, the Friends of the Longmont Museum, and our many museum donors and members. We simply couldn't do all that we do without you, so thank you. For more information about all that we do here, or to find out about how you can support the museum's work, visit longmontmuseum.org. About a year and a half ago, I was approached by a member of the City of Longmont's Climate Action Task Force, a retired university professor and acclaimed historian by the name of Peter Wood, with an idea to provide a series of programs that would engage and inform the community about the effects of climate change. Peter and I continued to brainstorm despite a pandemic, and tonight we're proud to kick off and unveil our Big Picture Climate Change series, co-presented by the mighty KGNU Community Radio out of Boulder, Sustainable Resilient Longmont, and the City of Longmont's Sustainability Program, with a special shout out to Francie Jaffe and Adara Nusrat. And so starting tonight and running through Thursday, our Stewart Auditorium becomes Climate Change Central, with each night dedicated to a different element. We begin tonight with air, then fire, followed by water, and lastly ending with Earth on Earth Day appropriately. Each program will feature a panel comprised of climate change scientists and other experts sharing what they've learned about these vast and shifting realms. The week will culminate with Sustainable Resilient Longmont's annual Earth Day celebration on Saturday, featuring programs for children and teens, and ending with a panel discussion on climate change, diversity, equity, and inclusivity. For more information on that, you can visit srlongmont.org. The Big Picture Climate Change series is marvelously co-curated, and the panels are deftly moderated by none other than journalist and co-host of KGNU's How on Earth, Susan Moran. The entirety of the series is available to view on the museum's live stream page, as well as Facebook and local Comcast cable. And it will be available recorded there for future viewing, if you'd care to have a look. For those of you viewing on Facebook tonight, you're invited to submit questions for our panel in the comments field. We'll do our best to get to as many as we can during the Q&A portion of the program. Now, allow me to introduce the co-curator of the Big Picture Climate Change series and our moderator, Susan Moran. Susan is a freelance journalist and editor and a host and producer of How on Earth, the KGNU science show. Her work has been published in the New York Times, The Economist, Biographic, Nature, and more. Susan was an adjunct journalism instructor at CU Boulder for 7+ years. She has served on the board of the Society of Environmental Journalism, was a Knight Science Journalism Fellow at MIT, and a TED Scripps Fellow in Environmental Journalism at CU Boulder. She previously worked on staff at Reuters, Tokyo, New York, Silicon Valley, Business 2.0 magazine, and other news organizations. She earned an MA in journalism from Columbia University and an MA in Asian Studies from UC Berkeley. Ladies and gentlemen, please say hello to Susan Moran.
Thanks so much, Justin, and thank you everyone for coming. Really appreciate it, and so sorry for the late start. We're going to try to end as close to 8:45 Mountain Time as possible. So thanks again, Justin. It's been great working with Justin over the months. And I want to say, just welcome, as he said, to the first of 4 panels. And we welcome you to come to all of them. Obviously, there's a lot of overlap, but we thought they are distinct enough to give them their own stage. And so our intention is to inform, educate, and inspire you, but all of us really, to engage in our communities and in the broader world in these issues, so that we all can be part of the solution, helping to make this world a better place for humans and other inhabitants. So we're not just talking about the effects, the impacts tonight, but solutions, what is being done, what can be done. And then I just thought, as we crawl out of this deep, dark tunnel of COVID, it seems like an opportune time to take stock, to listen, to learn from each other, and maybe even change, or at least stretch our minds enough to see and to take part in the new possibilities. So we expect to learn from you as well. So as Justin alluded to, line up your questions in chat, Facebook Live, and we'll get to them toward the end of the show. So I just want to jump right in, skip some of this, to introducing a panel of 4. I'm so proud and honored to have everyone. We have one via Zoom and the rest of us here on stage. So first, Dr. Danae Carlis, thanks so much. He's a meteorologist and the deputy director of the Global Systems Laboratory at NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration here in Boulder. And he came to the lab from the Weather Program Office, where he established the Earth Prediction Innovation Center program. Dr. Carlis held positions also as a research meteorologist at the National Weather Service Environmental Modeling Center, where he developed the world's most widely used weather forecast model. He also was a policy advisor to NOAA's chief scientist and NOAA's assistant secretary of environmental observations and prediction. And if you could hold it up, in 2006, he wrote a children's book, which is adorable, called MIT Meteorologists in Training. So if you got kids out there, keep him in mind. I'm sure sales could spike after tonight. And then Stacy Feldman next to Dr. Carlis, thanks so much for coming. She's a journalist with lots of expertise in climate issues. In fact, in 2007, Stacy co-founded Inside Climate News, which is a Pulitzer Prize-winning nonprofit news organization that offers reporting and analysis on climate change, energy, and environment. She's currently coming to, sadly, the end of her Ted Scripps Fellowship in Environmental Journalism at CU Boulder, and very excited to look to her now. She's just kicking out a startup called the Boulder Reporting Lab that'll be Boulder County's first digitally native nonprofit local newsroom, so check it out. And then next to Stacy, we have Dr. Detlev Helmig. He's an atmospheric scientist who still works on climate and air quality issues for some 35 years. And he studied forest decline, polar chemistry in the Arctic and the Antarctic, global air pollution, and most recently, he founded a startup called Boulder Atmospheric Innovation Research. The company conducts air monitoring on Colorado's Front Range, and his findings from his work have helped improve the understanding of oil and gas-related air quality and climate impacts, and to inform new policies for curbing emissions. And Dr. Helmig has been a former research professor at CU Boulder. Thanks so much. And then, visiting us on the screen, we have Brett Kincairn. Welcome. He's the City of Boulder's, basically he's the climate guy. He's the Senior Sustainability and Resilience Policy Advisor. And in that capacity, well, he's also director of what's called the Urban Drawdown Initiative. And for the city, he focuses on advancing climate action on so many levels. And Brett has extensive background in community-based sustainable development, working in both rural, Native American, and other disadvantaged communities across the Western US. And he's also founder or co-founder of several nonprofits and profits, including the Rogue River Institute for Ecology and Economy, Veterans for Green Jobs, and Community Energy Systems. Thank you all so much. Really proud and honored to have you. So we're gonna start with a little visual teaser. I'm gonna have Justin play, it's about a 4-minute clip from a documentary some of you may have seen called The Human Element by Jim Baylog, the National Geo photographer, and his team. So we'll start you with that, and then they're gonna have opening remarks.
Give it the gas. There goes. You know, I've always known in theory that the envelope of air that surrounds us is thin. Yet in fact, when I look up at the sky, it seems infinite.
Okay, so now I need you guys to walk away from me.
So I teamed up with a friend of
That's
mine
fine.
to send a camera up above the atmosphere
Keep going.
and experience how thin the air actually is.
2, 3, go. Whoa, look at that.
It took only 25 minutes for that balloon to rise to to what's basically the edge of the breathable atmosphere at 35,000 feet. How high is it?
And it's 61,000 feet.
Wow. Just a few minutes later, it was up at 70,000 feet, staring out into the blackness of space.
99,000 feet. There's the parachute.
Oh, there's the camera.
It's amazing.
Cameras are in perfect condition. Look at that. Continental divide. Fantastic. In less than half an hour, my balloon had floated up into what was essentially outer space. I found it incredible that our layer of air is so thin. For the first time in my life, I understood how finite and precious the air is. Matt, how do you know we're at the right spot? This is not a marked landing, is it?
I was counting 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi.
Oh, God. So when I step out, I can go for the long ride here? Let's
Yeah,
see.
theoretically.
Look at this. We get a chance to look into the sky, seeing the ebb and flow of all the gases in the air and the particulates in the air and how that affects the color of this substance that we're breathing. We can't see the air, but we still have an incredibly intimate relationship with it. You fill your lungs with air more than 20,000 times a day. So we can't avoid the fact that whatever we put into the air, we put into ourselves. The sky appears to be infinite, but it isn't infinite. We're all citizens of the global air supply.
Thanks so much to James Baylog and his group. So if you want to see the full film, The Human Element, it's a really powerful film. So let's go right into opening remarks and visuals. First, Dr. Danae Carlos, thanks again.
Thank you very much, Susan. I'm really honored to be here on this distinguished panel, especially being a newbie to Colorado. So I feel very welcome. Thank you. So if we could pull up the slides. If you could go to the second slide. All right, thank you very much. We can go to the next slide. So at NOAA Research, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, we believe that our research, our mission of science, service, and stewardship is well aligned with the current administration's priorities of tackling climate change, protecting public health and the environment, as well as advancing racial equity and supporting underserved communities. Some of our programs, such as the Sea Grant Office, the Climate Program Office, and the research and development work that's going on in our laboratories are really at the front and center of the work that fits into these particular priorities. And some of the priorities that we're looking at advancing are things like improving climate services, improving and sustaining ocean observations, improving forecasts of precipitation, severe weather, and water quality and quantity. And then fire weather is really starting to become really popular on the Hill as well, and becoming a priority. And of course, Coloradans definitely would be interested in that topic. So if you go to the next slide, the National Centers for Environmental Information, of course, this is part of NOAA. We call them the nation's scorekeeper in terms of addressing severe weather and climate events in the historical perspective. So it's part of their responsibility to monitor and assess the climate, and this particular center actually tracks and evaluates climate events in the US and globally that have great economic and societal impacts. So this particular slide really focuses on the impacts of extreme weather costs in 2020. So if you take a look at this, there's over 22 separate billion-dollar weather and climate disasters that happened in the United States during this time. And this actually shattered the previous record of 16 events which occurred in 2017 and 2011. These billion-dollar events included a record of 7 disasters linked to tropical cyclones, 13 to severe storms, 1 to drought, and also 1 to wildfires. And so these 22 events actually cost the nation a combined $95 billion in damages. As you can see, Colorado is featured prominently in this extreme weather cost analysis. And so these particular events, we started recording these events and reporting on these events back in 1980. So we've been doing this for well over 40 plus years. And over that time period, we've had over 285 weather and climate disasters that have reached or exceeded the $1 billion mark. And so, you know, along with everything that happened in 2020, you take a look at Colorado's fire season, which was exceptionally catastrophic, where we had over 625,000 acres burned across the state. And this was basically 3 of the largest recorded fires in Colorado history. And if you look at Governor Polis's budget, he did propose a $78 million FY21 budget, but you compare that to what the actual costs were, which was around $200 million in 2020 for fire suppression efforts. We need to, of course, make that budget what it should be so that we can, of course, protect our citizens. And so if you go to the next slide, this particular slide really is just an animated video that shows, you know, our ability to collect weather observations. Weather observations are one of the most important and crucial data that we collect within the agency, and we've been collecting it since the 1800s. And so some people say that climate is what you expect versus weather is what you get. But climate really is about the long-term average of temperature. This particular video shows sea surface temperature over the globe over the last year. You could run that video back if you really wanted to. And so if you look at the ocean, it has a huge impact on climate. So NOAA does its work in terms of monitoring ocean conditions through satellites, ships, and buoys. We have over 4,000 buoys that take daily measurements of the ocean surface. And then we also need to understand that this particular simulation you can see the El Nino or the El Nino Southern Oscillation. It's called ENSO. It's in the tropical Pacific Ocean, where there are actually 3 phases of ENSO. It's the El Nino, La Nina, or it's actually neutral. And the forecast today, right now, is that we are in a La Nina period. However, we're moving more towards ENSO neutral over the next couple of months. And and the scientists and forecasters are predicting an 80% chance of INSO neutral in the next few months. Now, the next slide really is from the NOAA Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory, and this is basically showing the temperature change from 1870 all the way out to 2100. And I show this because, you know, climate models really are a very useful tool in terms of predicting what's going to happen. We use it on a regular daily basis for our weather forecasts, but in this particular simulation, this goes well out past into the 2100s, and they provide a projection for scientists to assess confidence. And this particular climate model is used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and so we use these particular systems, these modeling systems, to do our projections and assessments of what could actually happen in the future. So if you go to the last slide, you'll see here the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which started back in 1988. It consists of over 195 member governments, and their focus really is on reviewing, recommending what the state of knowledge is on climate science and what the social and economic impacts are with respect to climate science as well. And so I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I know there's plenty more, so keep that in mind, and any questions, it's fine to put them in chat now if you have them for a specific speaker as they talk or after they talk, and we'll definitely come back to IPCC. So next, Dr. Detlev Helmeg. You've done so much on the Front Range already. I thought it'd be great to bring it to a state and local level. Take it away.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for having me here.
Hopefully take it away. Okay.
So I pulled out some slides to show you how climate protection and air quality protection are connected. And these are from some local observation mostly. But what I point out first is that for quite a bit longer than we've been thinking about protecting the climate, we've actually thought about protecting our air, protecting our air quality. This shows when the first implementation of the Clean Air Act happened. So that was 1963. It's on the left side. On the right side, I pulled out when catalytic converters became law in the United States to reduce air pollution caused from automobile exhaust. So they were implemented in 1975. So that's some 45 and 57 years ago. That's most of our lifetimes. So we've been thinking about air quality for quite some time. So where has that taken us? The next slide, please. So this shows data from the 2 ozone monitoring stations we have been running here in Longmont, one at the Longmont Airport, the other one at the Longmont Union Reservoir. And ozone is a really concerning, highly concerning gas because it's a strong oxidant, it's a respiratory irritant, it causes on the order of 6,000 to 10,000 premature deaths in the United States every year, according to estimates. And what most people don't realize is ozone is actually also a very important climate gas. It's ranked 3rd right after CO2 and methane that we hear and read a lot about in the news. And right next is ozone. So ozone causes a very significant amount of warming as well. So these graphs show a year and a half of ozone measurements from these 2 sites. And I've indicated in this yellow dotted line where the current ambient air national quality standard for ozone stands. That's meant to protect human health from severe effects of ozone. And you can see quite frequently the ozone recordings go above that line, indicating that we are in violation of the ozone air quality standards. There were 14 exceedances in 2020, and very surprisingly, we already had 2 exceedance days this year, just a few weeks ago, that exceeded that standard that's meant to protect the health of the citizens. So that's ozone. And the next slide, please. shows another example, and that's the next one of the important air pollutions that we worry about a lot. That's particulate matter. So those are small particles in the air that when you breathe air, make it deep into your lungs and can cause severe damage there. Mostly the chemicals that are here to these particles. And again, you can see this dotted line was exceeded pretty regularly last summer. We had 14 exceedance days in 2020. They were mostly triggered by wildfire smokes. If you were here last summer, you probably remember those. But another very surprising and amazing event was that in March, just a few weeks ago, we had 2 days where, 3 days where the standard was exceeded. And that was very unusual. That wasn't triggered by fires, but that was triggered by smog, photochemical smog that's formed here locally. So how can that be? So let's look at the next slide, please. Let me show this first. Yeah, so this event we had a couple weeks ago, to point this out in addition to that, is that this map shows the ozone recordings all over the United States in March, on March 20th. And if you look at where we are here in Boulder, Colorado, during this episode, we had the highest ozone in the whole country. So in terms of air quality, we had the poorest air quality within the United States. So what's triggering this? So let's go to the next slide, where I have 2 graphs that compare one of these pollutants we're concerned about, and this is ethane. Ethane is our favorite tracer for emissions, for oil and gas emissions, for petrochemical hydrocarbon emissions released from different operations. And that shows the ethane recordings from the Boulder Reservoir in this case, which is the top graph. So that's a year and a half of data again. And in comparison, the same gas from Nivot Ridge, which the arrow points to, which is up in the mountains, and that's where most of the air gets transported from into the Front Range. And you can see how significant the differences are. These graphs at the same scales. We really enrich the air here with these hydrocarbons. They are loaded with levels that are significantly higher than what's transported into the region. And that's a very important driver for the air pollution problems we are facing here. So the next slide, please. So that's, I put this on, that's instead of a year and a half, that's just the last 2 or 3 months of observations, again from the Longmont Union Reservoir. And if you look carefully at the previous graph, you actually saw how these concentrations go up and down, up and down, up and down a whole lot. And you can see this is even better here. So there are these peaks, these spikes that we see happening, every few weeks, every few months, where we have these plumes that make it across the region, which are really heavily enriched with these different hydrocarbons. And the important point here is these pollutants never really come alone by themselves. And again, here you see the connection between methane, ethane, propane, and these other gases, which all occur at the same time. The spikes go together. So while we're worried about methane mostly in terms of climate, but ethane, propane, butane in terms of air quality and ozone production, you can see these come together. So they're not separated. So we have climate-forcing gases and air pollution, air quality driving gases coming together from the same sources. So I think I have one more slide to wrap this up. And this is the last one. Here we have the methane, back to the methane from the Boulder Reservoir. And what I'm showing here in the left graph is a very interesting analysis where we look at what are the concentrations in methane depending on where the winds are coming from. So this is data plotted on a compass. And what are the concentrations, which are these colors here. And you can see on the right sides, that's where the site is located. That's where this asterisk is. And all these dots there on the map are the locations of oil and gas wells in the region. And you can easily see this association, how strongly the enhanced methane is correlated with the density of the oil and gas well network. So we take that as a very strong indication that in the area here, this industry distribution is a very significant contributor to the methane and the associated other petroleum hydrocarbons that we're observing at these different monitoring sites. And with that, I'm wrapping this up. So thank you very much again.
Thank you so much, and I would imagine we'll have a lot of questions later about living in Weld County, Boulder County, and elsewhere, given these this data. Stacy Feldman, welcome. So she's, in case some of you came late, she's a journalist and has just founded a local online news organization called the Boulder Reporting Lab. Thanks.
Thanks, Susan. It's great to be here. Slides? Great, thank you. So we have just been shown evidence, pretty alarming, pretty clear evidence of climate change, of this crisis, the billion-dollar weather disasters, the rising sea surface temperatures, the link between climate change and air pollution, fossil fuel production by the prominent scientists on the panel here. And if you're like me, you've been shown this evidence before, perhaps for years now. And yet here we are in 2021, and we have not been willing perhaps to really marshal an adequate national response. The reasons why are very, very complex, and we don't have the time to really delve into that. I'm here to focus on one piece of this very messy and large puzzle, and that is journalism. So, next slide. The reason why I'm even talking about this is here, number one, climate journalism matters a lot. So where do Americans get their information about climate change? So a 2020 poll showed that people are most likely to have first learned about climate change in the news, followed by social media and the internet, and you'll see there, number three, schools, which is a whole nother problem. Now, the majority of Americans say they continue to follow climate change in the news once they are aware of it. Again, climate journalism matters. Next slide. So we have more climate journalism today, particularly at the national level, than we have ever had before, and that is great. But journalism and climate journalism still has a problem, particularly our traditional media and mainstream media. I'm going to hone in on one particular issue, and that is our attachment, right, our industry's attachment to objectivity, right, this vague notion of needing to be objective when we're covering controversial issues, to find the middle. This results often in turning what is a political issue, and no doubt climate change is a political issue, into a politicized issue where there are valid, equal arguments on both sides, even if one side is patently false, full of misinformation. The results of this are profound. You can see the spattering of headlines here. In every one, you see the word both sides, right? Now, in some cases, both sides are in quotes to imply that there aren't both sides. But the message, I think, is very clear here. There is a Republican view of climate and climate science, and a Democratic view of climate and climate science, which obviously is ridiculous, right? Next slide. How can we fix this? What can we possibly do about this? I don't claim or pretend to have any solutions to this. This is quite complex, but I do want to point out where I see the most hope, and that is in local news. Now, Americans often say they trust local news more than their national news. They trust local news to provide them to get the facts right, to report on solutions, to report without bias, which are all incredibly important, particularly when we're covering climate change. Now, I want to just put an asterisk here and point out that communities of color report often say they have much less trust for all news, which makes a lot of sense when we consider history. Now, so why do I have hope? I mean, our local newspapers are being gutted as I speak, right? They're disappearing, and local climate reporters just aren't really a thing across America. think what's hopeful is that we're seeing a creative kind of reconstruction, that there are efforts in our communities across our country, including here, right in Boulder County, to rebuild our local news institutions. And the reconstruction of the local news business is not just about financial innovation, which is critical, but it's about editorial innovation. And it is about, or it should be, in my view, about creating financially sustainable local news organizations whose missions, explicit missions, are to help also create sustainable and healthier communities that are better informed about climate, enough perhaps to even act. Next slide. Now this is not easy at all. Climate action is up against a lot. I want to point out what I'm calling here the biggest hurdle of all, and that is a psychological perception barrier. The scholar Rob Nixon introduced this term up here on the slide, slow violence, about 10 years ago in his book. Just became acquainted with this. He writes that at the heart of slow violence is the paradox of the long-term emergency, and that is climate, a long-term emergency. And the long-term, he explains, usually we put off long-term issues, right? And the paradox is that a slow emergency, right? Climate change is compounding over time to create ever worsening emergencies that are getting closer to our present, and that's where we are today. Those are the billion-dollar disasters that we saw mapped. Now, how do we tell this story? It's incredibly complex, and frankly, our public sphere is not very good right now at explaining complexity. Next slide. I think one thing we could do, certainly as journalists, but even as consumers of information, as people who talk about climate change, is to frame the issue differently, to change the narrative. Climate change is a public health emergency today, right? And we need to frame it as such. When we retire a coal plant, or as we transition away from fossil fuel dependency, we're saving lives. We're helping address childhood asthma, respiratory illness, and air pollution is nasty. It is horrifying. We heard earlier that it leads to 200,000 premature deaths, I believe, annually. And just one last very brief point, climate change is also an economic vitality story, and we need to better understand and talk about that there are whole economies that are emerging, or even being prevented from emerging in inaction. To understand that, we need to better understand that there's something generative and creative and positive going on all around us, right? That climate is not just this wet blanket story of destruction, that it's also about reconstruction. And for me, it's quite similar, in fact, to what's happening in our local news industry.
Thank you so much, Stacy. Rarely do I give a plug to go buy things, but I keep thinking the anchor advertisers for local newspapers. Look at Macy's here, look at Best Buy. These are the anchors for the Daily Camera, which is why the paper's getting thinner and thinner. Go buy stuff from local stores. But there's also the nonprofit model, which hopefully will be helpful. Brett Kincairn, for those who may have joined late, I'm just going to call you the climate advisor for Boulder County. A very long, prestigious title you can give it, but he's done so much work for Boulder City and many cities actually across the country. So take it away, up to 5 minutes. Thank you. Are we not getting sound from Brett Kincairn? Can the audience hear Brett now?
Can you hear me now? Yes, you can. So Susan, you guys can hear me now? No.
Hopefully we have an audience who can hear Brett now. Brett, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Susan. Can you hear me?
You can hear me. It sounds like, but I can't hear you.
That's tragic. You can hear me? Okay. Well, then, good evening, everyone. I am delighted to join you, although remote. I'm living here in Boulder, so not too far away from all of our good friends in Longmont. I'm going to talk this evening about I think, a hopeful sign in the climate efforts, and one that is all around us. So I think we often think of climate action as something almost exclusively related to changing our energy systems. And in fact, that has been what our work has focused on for over 20 years. But just in the last couple of years, as we'll see, the is that any better? I'll turn off my mic. Over the last few years, we're starting to actually see that one of our biggest allies in the climate struggle is actually the planet that we live on. So I don't know if I guess I may not be able to share my screen. The host has disabled the share screen. Is that something that you could quickly turn off here? Or give me the screen to be able to show my slides here? Let's see. Can you hear me? You can hear me. If I can, I guess I could just speak without slides if that's what that's what will work. Okay, I've got it. Thank you. All right, well, of course we would expect a certain amount of technical challenge here. First time out in this incredible event. So I just want to talk this evening about this whole new front, if you will, in the climate action work, and that is working with the planet that we live on. This is really based on the science that came out. Let's see, let's try this one more time. So in 2018, so I think as many of you know, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change publishes a report every 4 years or so. And so the last of these reports that was published was in 2018 when the IPCC issued a report on the progress we were making, as it turns out, the lack of progress around the Paris Climate Accords that happened in 2015. So this was called the 1.5 degree report. But it really came out with some unexpected and surprising findings that have really changed in many ways the way we're thinking about climate action. The first thing it said, which was no surprise, is that climate change is actually advancing faster than we had originally projected. And that's, I think, what the science is almost always going to say, because it has to be intrinsically conservative. But the second thing it said, which was the real game changer, is that for more than 20 years, it's been telling us that we have to stabilize climate by reducing emissions. And what this new report said was, because we've actually put so much CO2 into the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases, emissions reduction alone will not be enough to stabilize climate. We actually have to initiate carbon drawdown, carbon sequestration, drawing carbon out of the atmosphere at a rapidly escalating pace. And that was a sort of a finding that many people hadn't actually foreseen or hadn't been watching for. And then the last thing it said is that climate change is now going to happen at such a pace and intensity that we have to start preparing our communities for that. Now, we know this already all around us. We've seen the floods. We've been having fires. This last fall was, of course, a terrifying one for all of us. I wanted to show you this slide because this is a slide I showed in 2014 when we were still arguing whether or not climate change was happening. And this was a report that came out from the National Academy of Sciences that said for every 1 degree Celsius increase, there we will see a very significant increase in fire incidents. And in fact, if you look at that sort of dark red place that's sort of labeled J in our state, that's where we live. It was saying that for every 1 degree increase Celsius, our area will see something like a 600 to 700% increase in fire. And sure enough, that's kind of what's happening now. And it's not just, of course, what happens surrounding it, it's what happens within our communities itself. This is another report that came out in 2018 from the Union of Concerned Scientists called Killer Heat in the United States. And this statistic is really terrifying that by roughly mid-century, nearly a third of all communities over 50,000 will be experiencing a heat index of 30 days or more of a heat index over 105 degrees. There are only 3 places in the United States that currently experience that: Yuma, Indio in California, and Yuma in Arizona. So we are heading toward conditions that we haven't built for. But the good news is that we actually have solutions, especially in the context of working with the natural world. And so there's a whole new field that's emerging called natural climate solutions. And that analysis has shown that we should be able to generate something like a third of all the emissions reduction that we need simply by working with the natural world. And part of this is actually changing our conception of what carbon is and recognizing that it's an incredibly valuable asset. In fact, of course, we're made of carbon. We consume carbon 3 or 4 times a day. But we sort of vilified it because we keep putting it in the wrong place. And what we need to do is capture that carbon and not just put it away where we can't use it anymore, actually channel it, manage it back into living systems where it can then help produce a whole series of the ecosystem services that we're going to need more and more of: shade, water infiltration, nutrient dense food, air quality. All of those things are things that our natural world is actually really good at delivering if we will work with it. And so it's also interesting that even places like urban forests are have much greater capacity than we might think of them. There's something like 15% of all the forest carbon that's sequestered in the United States is actually in urban forests. It also, as I said, produces all these other benefits. This is just from the city of Boulder's urban forest strategic plan, where we calculated that on an annual basis, our urban forests are generating over $1 million over $1 million in these ecosystem services. So just to say really quickly, this work is now going to scale. We've helped to launch a national initiative, which is currently building a proposal in Congress and the new administration to pump billions of dollars into things like urban forests. We're working with a big Denver Metro consortium to actually figure out how we would rapidly scale up that industry, employ hundreds more people doing this work, and be able to actually create these kinds of urban landscapes that can provide all these benefits. So I'll just close by saying, for me, this is where I see my hope in this work. This is my son, Nathaniel, standing on a city-owned property that we have. It's one of our agricultural properties that, through a combination of climate change, impacts of prairie dogs and others, we had basically lost it. It had become essentially a barren desert. And over the course of less than a year, through a lot of this concerted work with those systems, we were able to start bringing that back. And I believe that that's the kind of thing that we should be able to do, not only locally, but very much at a global scale. So thank you very much for the chance to speak this evening.
Everyone, thank you for hanging in there. We're living and learning, and sorry, this is the first night, but hopefully we'll try to keep it to another 15 minutes or so. So few questions at least, and hopefully we've got some lined up if you got any Q&A in the chat. I wanted to ask you, Danae, Dr. Carlos, it seems at least a bit of good news, and I know the bar is set pretty low these days for good news on climate, but
just to say really
that,
quickly,
wasn't it
this
just
work is now going to
last
scale.
year in
We helped,
2020,
to launch a
CO2
national
emissions
initiative, which is
fell
currently
by
building
nearly
a proposal in
6%. And
Congress
that
and
was
the new
apparently the
administration
largest
to
annual
pump billions of
percentage
dollars
decline
into things like
since World
urban
War II.
forests. We're working with
And
the
many
big
point
Denver
to,
Metro
and there is
Consortium.
the COVID factor, less driving, less flying, but the largest reason is really that the share of renewables in global electricity generation rose from 27% 2019 to 29%, biggest increase on record according to EIA. That's a positive trajectory. I know 1 year does not make a trajectory, but, and Brett, you could chime in here perhaps after Danae. Is this good news? Is this pretty promising going forward? Does it all depend on policy and people, of course?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think it's good news, but it's also news that we have, an administration that's really interested in tackling this particular crisis. And so if you look at where we are with respect to the federal budget of having over $1.4 billion of new funding, especially within an agency like NOAA, to work towards solutions and work towards better understanding and communication of the climate issue, then that part to me is also good news. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, and Brett Kincairn of Boulder, do you want to add anything to that? Not sure if he's connected. Oh. Be with a budget. And there was something recent that said if we plant 1 trillion trees around the world, it could remove 200 billion tons of carbon from the atmosphere, which sounds like a lot. The caveat is that's 3.5 million square miles that would be needed of new forest land, and that's about the size of the US. How does that ring true to you? And you're talking more about not just Boulder, but so many cities around the US and around the world that could be doing a lot more to plant trees as a way to sequester the carbon, and Detlef, maybe you can chime in after, to curb air pollution problems. Can you hear me, Brett? Oy vey. I'm sorry, everyone. Detlef, let me just ask you then, because if Brett can't hear this, that is, we wouldn't call it geoengineering per se, and I kind of want to jump into that a bit on the so-called solutions front, but could it be that a ton of tree planting throughout the United States, throughout the world, I mean, we know the ravages of deforestation, but could it also do a lot to reduce the health impacts from air pollution? All that sequestering in the leaves.
That's a really good question. Thanks for asking that. There has been a fair amount of research done on the study of the effects of urban vegetation on air quality. So there's a pretty good base of knowledge on that. And the bottom line of that is, yeah, there's a connection. There are benefits in terms of air quality from planting of trees. And it's a few things that we may not think about right away, but one major one is shading. You know, the shading that urban trees provide. It introduces the heat island effect that, inner cities are, depending on where they are in the weather situation, 3, 4, 5 degrees hotter than the surrounding areas. That's the urban heat island. So planting a lot of trees through the evaporation of the water, the shading of building, through changing the albedo, that's the amount of radiation that gets reflected. So trees do have a positive impact on our urban climate and air pollution. Another major benefit is that trees take up pollutants. We think about the CO2 in terms of carbon sequestration, but trees also take up ozone, they take up particulates, which are, the two very significant air pollutants when it comes to human health. So they provide more surface area to remove those pollutants from the atmosphere. So this is a fair amount of knowledge we have that links urban revegetation, planting trees, to benefits on urban air quality.
Yeah, and Brett, can you hear me? I guess I can't hear him, so I don't know. So I'm going to skip that for now. I know we don't have too much time, but I want to ask something else on geoengineering. And first of all, given how dire the problem is, how we're already pretty darn close to climate catastrophe, and I don't want to give so many numbers, other than to really ask, should nuclear be an option we take seriously? I mean, comparing the economic costs, the challenges of storage and safety related to waste storage, but from a climate perspective, it sure looks a lot better than more coal plants, which at least economically are being slowly phased out, at least in the US, but that's just a dent in the emissions. Any of you want to take a crack at this before I ask you a geoengineering question?
I mean, I'll just weigh in quickly. I just think economically, there isn't really a case for nuclear, not at a time when wind and solar are substantially cheaper. We haven't had a nuclear plant built in America in many, many, many years, and it's my understanding that it's not really a solution on the table, just taking the safety question aside, which is its own debate. Just economically, it simply makes no sense.
And what about, and I've done a lot of work with climate and weather, there's so many different sort of pilot projects related to geoengineering, whether it's the solar radiation, shooting up reflective particles in the atmosphere, or burying CO2. I don't know if any of you have read Under the White Sky. Elizabeth Colbert has just come out with a new book, and one of the projects is taking like corn stalks and burying them at the bottom of the ocean, more like in basaltic rock. But these also cost a ton of money, a ton of energy, and yet many scientists, engineers anyway, would say we can't afford not to put these on the table now. Dr. Carlos or anyone else want to?
I think that's a
Take a
great
crack?
question for Detlef. He's worked a lot in these particular areas.
Well, the topic of geoengineering and the risks versus the benefits, it's a very controversial one. So in my community, you get many different opinions on that.
And yours.
And I don't think my own one matters a whole lot. I don't think we have consensus. I have this a strong part of my community that believes that putting our energy to the maximum possible in reducing emissions would be a wiser way to go and more promising and a way that we know, that we understand where it will take us, whereas geoengineering approaches have a whole set of uncertainties associated to it, and I think many of us don't have the confidence that we understand the risks and the uncertainties well enough, and the associated costs. And many of the geoengineering approaches do take a lot of energy again. So taking all that together, there's a fair number in my community out there that's rather skeptical towards geoengineering approaches.
I want to take at least a few questions from the audience, but first, I'm not sure if we have Brett, hopefully we do, but I want to give each of you a chance to say one or two things, like takeaways, messages you think would be really helpful for the audience, be it on a local, national level, and I don't mean like seal your windows for energy efficiency, although that's important, but whether it's on an individual level, a citywide, a regional, or national or global level. What's a takeaway message? Let me start with you, Brett, if you can hear me.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I sure can.
Yeah, I guess the one thing I'd say is there's a saying now becoming somewhat popular that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to the end of capitalism.
Wait, then
problem
the
that
end
we
of the
have
what?
right now is that the economy does not value what we need the economy to do. We need to be regenerating living systems at an absolutely enormous scale in order to allow this system to rebalance itself. And if we're going to be able to do that, we're warehousing human beings all over the planet, whether it's refugee camps or prisons, when we should be mobilizing and resourcing people to go out and do this work. Why are we talking about extremely expensive geoengineering experiments when we know what to do in terms of regenerating landscapes that can actually stabilize climate, not only globally, but locally? So I think we need to actually have an honest conversation about the priorities of the economy. And we're going to start that actually this fall, or in May. We're going to start a series of 6 conversations over the course of 6 months where we're bringing in some of the best thinkers on the economy in the world as a part of a bolded forum on the economy and climate. So we can start actually normalizing this piece that we need an economy that serves life.
Great, thank you. And stay tuned for that. So in May, the Boulder Forum on Economy and Climate. Dr. Carlos, how about you? Any takeaway messages you want to drive home?
To me, it's about conversation. It's about communication. It's about leadership. I think it's way past time that we continue to push ourselves in this particular area, because in some sense we're a society that waits for a disaster to happen before we actually do something about it. And that's, at that time, it's too late. So I believe that our kids are going to continue to lead us into the future. You know, these young people really get me excited. As you know, there's people on in social media that are influencing this particular conversation. So that part is what gets me excited about having this particular conversation, and our ability to continue to understand and educate ourselves in this particular area.
Appreciate the work you're doing on that as well. So you can hold up that book again for kids who want to be meteorologists and climate scientists.
That's right.
I love it. MIT, meteorologists in training. Stacy Feldman, journalist, any closing thoughts, messages?
I also see a tremendous amount of hope in younger people. My kindergartner came home from school a couple weeks ago, and in her backpack I found a worksheet about climate change and connecting climate change to extreme weather with pictures. And I didn't learn about climate change when I was in kindergarten, and so I think we're okay with the younger generations, and we even see among younger people some of the massive divides in acceptance of climate change and climate science between Republicans and Democrats shrinking. That gives me a lot of hope. I guess the question that I would ask is it going to be too late, right? Can we wait for them to grow up and solve this problem for us? So, you know, in the near term, going back to sort of my original comments, is I believe also, as Danae said, in conversation and information, and encourage people, if you care about climate change, to invest in local journalism in particular, particularly independent journalism, homegrown journalism in your communities. I think at the community level, we have the potential to sow new conversations and to advance a solutions conversation and to combat misinformation.
Great. I want to meet that kindergartner. Dr. Helmig, how about you?
Sure, yeah. So if you're living in this area with me here, then we're all living together in a region that's in what's called a non-attainment with air quality standards, in particular with the ozone air quality standards. We've been exceeding the ozone air quality standard year after year after year, and that's continuing. We may actually be downgraded which will mean we're one of the very, very few places in the United States, it may be the only one, that's going the opposite direction where most other regions in the country are going, which is towards better air quality. There are estimates that on the order of 100 people die every year in Colorado alone because of the poor air quality, because of compromises in air quality. And I want to re-emphasize that fighting air pollution and improving air quality goes hand in hand with climate protection. They are very closely connected because they're both linked to emissions of greenhouse gases and air pollution, and there's a lot of overlap. So what we do for improving air quality will improve the climate. What we're doing to improve the climate will improve air quality. So in the path there, the most promising path is reducing emissions.
I know we're at a little past 8:45 our time, but we'd love to take a few questions. So Justin, what have you got?
Okay, here from Facebook, we've got a number of questions here, including one from Tom for Dr. Carlos, and this refers to your presentation. Extreme weather costs come from two factors: the actual events themselves and the degree to which we've made ourselves vulnerable by continuing to develop in places like fire-prone forests and low-lying areas vulnerable to storms. Do we know how much of the damages you cited comes from increases in the number and intensity of extreme weather events, and how much comes from our continued development in particularly vulnerable areas?
That's an excellent question that I definitely think that it doesn't necessarily distinguish those two when they go into developing those assessments. It's really about the economics, and it's about the impact, are really the two areas that they're really trying to measure. And there's a paper online, if you go to NCEI's website, where it really breaks down that assessment and how they go about developing those numbers. It's a peer-reviewed paper that you could take a look at. And so I would recommend just search billion-dollar disasters NOAA, and you'll find some really much more detailed information on what the process actually is in terms of doing that work.
Thank you. And here's a question from David from Facebook. Planting 1 trillion trees removes what % of CO2 from the atmosphere?
That's for Brett.
Yeah.
Well, I think that the statistics that Susan was referring to are talking about something like 1/4 of a gigaton of CO2. I think you have to be careful about whether you're talking about carbon emissions or CO2 emissions. I think we emit somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 gigatons of carbon annually as a globe. That's about 40 gigatons of CO2. So, I think the number that was listed is, somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe 5%. But one of the things we have to be really careful about is that it's not just about how many molecules of carbon you get out of the atmosphere. It's about what you do with the carbon that you capture. And if we can capture that carbon and direct it into living systems in ways that can actually enhance landscapes that transpire water, that actually then through that latent heat management cool areas, we can do that to actually increase the air pollution filtration capacity of our living systems, that we can increase the capacity to hold more water when we're getting storm events. That's many benefits that we can get from that carbon. So we shouldn't think about it as just we need to take a carbon molecule and stick it somewhere where it's out of the way.
Thank you.
Let's see here.
Maybe 2 more?
Yeah. Another David from Facebook. With so many billion-dollar fire and weather disasters now occurring over the past recent years, how is the property insurance industry being affected? Does anybody know the answer to that? Could their support help the action move forward?
I didn't hear the last part of the question.
Oh, could their support, meaning the insurance industry, somehow help the action move forward? That sounds like a Brett question too, doesn't it?
Well, I think we're seeing shifts in the insurance agencies, or especially the reinsurance companies, the companies that insure the insurers. I heard Swiss Re, who is one of the major international Swiss insurance reinsurers, saying a 2-degree world is essentially uninsurable. So we're already starting to see moves in certain insurance companies to no longer insure certain kinds of coastal properties. I'm afraid that we're going to start to see more uninsurable properties in some of the fire-prone regions as well. So I think we're going to see that market respond almost whether we want to or not.
And really, this lastly, I think it's really more of a clarification for you, Brett. Lydia from Facebook wants to know, are you saying we should use humans? Are you saying you want to use humans who are being warehoused for free labor, or that you want to eliminate the warehousing of people? That connection was unsettlingly unclear. So I'll let you just clarify that.
Well, I'm saying we're having what to me seems like a kind of silly conversation about universal basic income, which essentially assumes that human beings are no longer useful for anything, when in fact we should be recognizing the value of all human beings and actually giving them the resources that they need to go out and do meaningful work, which needs to be done. There are so many elements of our living world that need to be regenerated, and when they become regenerated, will actually benefit us in all kinds of ways. And that all these people that we're currently sort of not viewing as valuable by putting them in refugee camps or keeping them in prisons, they could be equipped and resourced and trained to do a lot of really valuable work in this world. That's what I was trying to refer to.
Thank you. Let me see if we maybe have one more here. Any more questions from Facebook? Doesn't look like it.
Well, I want to say thank you, everyone. Thanks for your patience. We're learning, and hopefully you'll come back. And I know all these will be very distinct. We have different panelists and different focus tomorrow night on fire, following night on water, and then on Earth Day, the 22nd, is an Earth kind of ag focus. So thank you again so much. Brett Kincairn from Boulder City. Thank you, Dr. Danae Carlos of NOAA, Stacy Feldman, journalist extraordinaire. Here's to nonprofit, local, independent journalism, and Dr. Detlev Helmeg of Boulder Air. Thank you so much, everyone. And I know the audience is clapping out there. And thanks, Justin, and thank you so much to sponsor KGNU.
And thank you, Susan, and see you all tomorrow for our next program. Good night.